We wanted something wide-ranging, a conversation that had time to expand, to explore an author's work for an hour, longer than you might find in a bookstore reading, but less technical than you'd find in a poetry journal. We won't take questions at the end, but when we go across the hall to the reception, you're free to talk to the poet and ask your questions there in a more intimate, personal setting. Again, thank you so much for coming. So let's just sit back and see where this takes us. In one of your poems, you refer to the glamour you manage. And as I read your work again and again, that's what you do. You manage glamour. You think of the word glamour as like magic or occult knowledge. It does seem very close to what a poet of your quality does. And you know, one of your poems you write, Mary worries about not having enough words in her head. Is that the poet's most fundamental anxiety? Not having the words in your head?
It's one of them. It's certainly one of mine. The desire to have as much, as in some ways as wide-ranging materials as you can possibly reach to, and words are part of that. I think, I'm not entirely sure, but I think the word glamour is actually related to grammar. I think they're from the same, and so I think they're actually the sort of two big tools in some ways that we have, the arrangement and then just the stuff of words, right. and bringing the language to the structures, and the grammar is
magic.
Can be.
Yeah, it is often in your poetry. When we started this series, I had no idea that what all these great poets would have in common are bees. You all write about bees. What is it with bees and great poets? You mention bees many times in your poetry. So does Carl Phillips. So did Nick Flynn. They all mention bees. What is it about bees? You have not thought about this.
I've not thought about this.
Now, every time you write about bees, you're going to feel self-conscious.
I think in some ways maybe they're an emblem of this creature we see around us all the time, at least during a season, that is at this labor of making something we associate with sweetness.
Yes.
Right? So isn't that sort of what a lot, I mean, I think I relate to, wanting one's labor
to be sweet?
to result in something sweet, sure.
Nature plays a huge role in your poetry. We'll get to religion, which I know is a big theme, but nature plays a huge role in your poetry too. Are you an outdoorsy person? Several of the poems take place outdoors. You're outdoors working, you're outdoors walking.
Yeah. No, I like being outdoors. In really simple ways. I mean, just being in the backyard, walking, being absorbed in the world that is not just the world you've made.
Right.
Right, or the world that you have assembled in your house or somebody else has structured here or elsewhere. My friend Molly Lou Freeman once said that she has to spend some time every day looking at something from the natural world, because otherwise she feels like she actually stops seeing. Yes. In a way that it's something to refresh the eye, as she says it, and I very much relate to that, because every petal, every flower is a little bit different, right? They're a surprise.
And that's why those elements show up in your poems. That's why you use those poems. That's why you use those elements.
Well, I mean, we use what we have, and we use what we're drawn to, I suppose.
Right.
Using
you found it inspiring?
Do I find the natural world inspiring? I don't know if it's as simple as going out and here's a flower and I'm inspired by the flower and
Right.
I'm going to write about the flower. I don't think it's quite like that.
Right.
But wanting, in some ways, to bring as much of the fullness of one's world to the poems as possible, and
Right.
that's part of it.
When I was reading Carl Phillips' work, I found all these religious poems. And so I prepared all these questions about his religious background. And so I began by asking him, tell me about your religious upbringing. And he immediately says, I didn't have one. My parents were atheists. I didn't know anything about it. I became interested in religion in a very academic way in high school. That was not your situation, though, right? No. What was your religious upbringing like?
Well, I was raised in the Catholic faith by two very devout parents.
Yes.
And,
Did you take to it? Did you find it awkward or uncomfortable?
well, I did take to it, and I did find it awkward. I spent years wanting to be a nun. I mean,
Really?
I took it very seriously.
So it spoke to you in a deep, sincere
Very
way.
deeply. I mean, riding the bus to school, I would be going through Hail Marys in my head. I mean, that was very much my world, and the world I claimed and felt like I belonged to. But there was also an uncomfortable element to it from very early on
What was that?
as well, and that I think I learned a lot of fear from it.
Fear of sin, fear
Yes.
of fear of sin.
I mean,
hell.
absolutely. I mean, as a child, I was deeply afraid
This is a physical reality.
of hell, that I was going to do something to be lost forever, right? It was a real
high stakes.
visceral fear, and I think also there was a way in which it made me afraid of language. In this way that I remember once, I had this habit of saying, I think, whenever I said anything. I would just have this repetitive, I think. And my mother at one point said, Mary, stop saying I think after everything. It's just, tiresome. And she didn't say it quite like that, but she and I said, but I'm so afraid that if I don't, what I say might be a lie.
Wow.
That I had to couch everything in that this is just what I think
Right.
at this moment, that I'm not doing any truth claims because that might damn me forever.
It could be
You know,
deceitful, it could be prideful, all those things.
All of those things. So I think the answer is both.
But that tradition gave you a rich series of metaphors, of language, a history of religious myths to deal with. That was its compensation.
Yeah. No. There was a lot. I mean, there were huge realms to dwell in imaginatively, that one wasn't just in one's physical world.
Right.
I wasn't. I mean, a lot of kids have imaginary friends, right? My imaginary friend was Jesus. I really imagined he came down for play dates. We would swing, and that. So, it definitely, I think, provoked a lot of imagination in the sort of way it prompted me to imagine my place in things.
There are some moments of real spiritual despair in your first book. You didn't have a Mary McCarthy moment where your faith just whoop, evaporated in a moment.
I kind of did.
You did?
Yeah.
Because there's no anxiety when she loses her faith. She just realizes, oh, what a silly idea that was, and she moves on.
No, mine was very sad.
It was a sense of loss.
It was a huge sense of loss. And I remember, feeling like the sense of faith was this really precious thing I had that I didn't want to lose, and I became at some point very afraid.
You could sense it being threatened.
Yes. and I would even like write letters to myself, like, you know,
To your future doubtful
to my
self.
future, right? Like, you know, to talk myself out of losing it. And I do remember, you know, one afternoon as a teenager being in my room. I'm the oldest of 5 children, so at some point I moved up into the attic, which was not a real room, but that was my that was my space. And being up there and just almost feeling it leave my body.
Really?
Yeah, and it was incredibly sad, and it was like I couldn't hold on to it. It was like, but it was such a very particular sense looking back at it in terms of what I thought faith was.
What did you think it was?
Well, I thought it was just the ability to purely believe, right? Or this sort of, I think, a real sense of faith as knowing in some way, right? Like, you know, I look at it and it almost seems hilarious to me on some level now that I almost thought of faith as almost like this precious pure virginity kind of thing.
Yes,
right?
it does.
Like
Yes.
losing faith or losing that it's
Right.
this pure sort of thing that you have or you don't, and you believe or you don't believe, and it's not something that can be messy or complicated or even engaged with, right?
Right.
That I mean, it's a very weird idea in some ways that faith as knowing, right? Because I think that's not what actually faith
It's the substance of things not
is.
seen.
Yeah, it's some sort of larger willingness to maybe be open or engage. I mean, it's one of the reasons I came to love Hopkins so much. In some way, his love not of sort of purity, right? But glory be to God for dappled things,
Yes.
right? Not the immaculate world, but a world full of, you know, messiness and spots and variations,
Right.
and things on the move, right? Not something static and simple and pure.
Right. In one of your poems, you talk about being attacked and robbed during Mardi Gras. Remember that poem?
I do.
It ends with, "Who told me? Who told me God was personal?" You have this sense of like, oh my, how did I fall for that?
Right.
In another poem you write about a loved one dying, "I would like to imagine that you are not in danger, that we have selves more solid than stars, that we are safe in the pages of books we can reopen to look at each other." And then you conclude, "I have no ideas about happiness and no patience to imagine it possible." And it's just desperately sad.
Well, and that's in the context of that it's a poem called "Approaching Elegy," so
Someone is dying.
it's in that context.
Right,
yeah.
right. What draws you back then, having described that loss of faith, that desperate loss of faith, that sadness, what keeps drawing you back to religious language and religious images and even the terms of theology after that sense of orthodoxy has faded away? I mean, you haven't given that up at all. For instance,
Yeah, no, it's a big.
imagine that you had lost your faith and then you turned to a very sort of scientific
Yeah.
nomenclature, but you haven't.
Right.
You've retained a lot of religious imagery and language.
Right.
Why is that? What still appeals to you as a poet?
Well, you know, I think there was such a kind kind of beauty and magic in it that is not entirely gone. You know, you mean, I think about how much of the art I love was inspired within, anyway, this tradition, if not by it.
Right.
And, you know, even the sense of prayer, right? I mean, it's kind of an amazing thing to feel like I can say words in my head and a consciousness beyond me can receive them.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that's a hard thing to give up.
Yes, it is a very lovely idea. Otherwise, you're alone.
Right. And so, you know, and there's a lot of ways in which I feel nurtured by this.
Continue to feel nurtured.
I do. And so I think one of the things I've been very interested in is thinking about ways to carry forward what has nurtured me, but maybe, you know, not in a sort of flattened out symbolic way, right? So often, you know, here's this scene and we hold it up just as a symbol of belief, right? Here's what it means. You know, I think a lot of what's great about the tradition doesn't actually work that way, right? That there are great promptings and struggles. And I also began to realize at some point that, at least in my experience, just saying, I reject this, so I'm going to think a different way now, right? It's not so simple, right? I mean,
it does seem to be for some people.
Maybe it is. It wasn't for me.
I find faith very sticky.
I do too, and so part of what I started thinking about was, well, just ignoring this isn't going to make it go away, right? You know, so if it's with me, how can I have a relationship to it that feels productive and that is enlarging my experience rather than feeling like it's bearing down in a narrow way on it, that it's, you know, here's the simple lens and you can't see beyond it, right?
Which I think is the way atheists think, people of faith think.
Right. But to say, well, maybe I can actually use some of it as a lens to re-see.
Yes.
Right, in ways that I couldn't have gotten to myself, right? That are, you know, I really like Flannery O'Connor saying, faith will be the light by which you see, but it will not be what you see.
Very
and
nice.
It will not be a substitute for seeing, right?
Nice.
That's not how I want to use it. But the idea that it can be a kind of light or lens, and one can actually start using it in creative ways, that's what I was interested in.
Yeah. That comes across clearly in many of your poems. If you'd read this opening poem from Granted, Mutatis Mutandis, is that even close to pronounce? Okay. I'm very interested in the way you move from something very simple and elemental and natural to something very big.
Mutatis mutandis. Pebbles, leaves, rain, they disappear into the river. Even the shadow of the black branches above, their bark peeling like thick burnt paper, disappear. But we don't disappear, not into the breeze. It brushes against the pale sides of our arms, rustle of dry leaf against wood, quick suckle of an inhale, cool shearing of cracks. Granted, this is not a world that keeps us. Granted, there are some sadnesses in which I do not long for God.
So beautiful. The way you begin with the sort of permanence of the material world and then end up with our impermanence and our longing for God. It's a startling conclusion, the way it moves. The poem is gorgeous. In another one of your poems, you refer to the lush anger of atonement. That could come right out of John Donne. I mean, that is such a metaphysical poet kind of line. The lush anger of atonement. But it's entirely your own. I wonder if you'd read that poem. It's called The Naked and the Unashamed on page 4.
Naked and unashamed are two different moments. If I were a classical nude, the distance between my breasts would be the same as the distance from my breasts to my navel, from my navel to the division of my legs. I accuse myself of transgressing. What is it to drag a body through the lush anger of atonement? Always in the arms of something, the God is always swaddled like the infant, the cloth on his hips. Sometimes I believe I am transgressing. When I consider the body in the manger, I feel it in my face. I must look the same way a hunter looks when he decides to take an animal he has never seen before.
It's great. It's a great, great ending. I feel like I'm transgressing. I think that line works, as I consider all the poems you write. I get this sense that you're transgressing, that you're doing something with religious images that they're not meant to do, that's surprising, that's startling. Do you feel that you're transgressing sometimes?
Sometimes, yeah, but I don't know that I'm ever doing it just to transgress.
No, I didn't mean that.
Right?
Yes.
A transgression, a crossing over to reach toward a new arrival.
Yes. Right. Now, in your new book, you write a lot about the Annunciation. Yes, in every different way imaginable. In really mind-expanding ways, from Mary's point of view, from Gabriel's point of view, in ancient times, in contemporary times, from the point of view of the grass, from the point of view of seagulls eating a whale. There are a lot of different ways you imagine that pretty remarkable moment in religious history, right? Sometimes violent, sometimes erotic.
Yes.
To get us started, would you read a short poem called Annunciation? It's toward the back, hope you don't mind.
Annunciation, Eve to Ave. The wings behind the man I never saw, but often afterward I dreamed his lips, remembered the slight angle of his hips, his feet among the tulips and the straw. I liked the way his voice deepened as he called. As for the words, I liked the showmanship with which he spoke them. Behind him, distant ships went still. The water was smooth as his jaw. And when I learned that he was not a man, bullwhip, horsewhip, unzip, I could have crawled through thorn and bee, the thick of hive, rosehip, courtship, lordship, gossip, and lavender. But I was quiet, quiet as eagerness, that astonished, dutiful fall.
I've never thought about Gabriel unzipping. I didn't even picture him wearing pants, frankly.
Right.
What else would he be wearing? I don't know. I'm really going to go there. I understand. Go on.
Well, the scene, the scene of the Annunciation, I think, does have some sexual charge to it, right? I mean, it's a scene where a woman is alone and is visited
in the
by
night. Yes.
This right, and is then with child, right?
Yes.
So I think that's part of what I'm picking up on here from Mary's point of view, and trying to allow her some sense of bodily erotic experience, right? Which is, I think, not how we tend to think of Mary. I mean, again, that sense of what is expected, right? What is a female body supposed to look like, like in that last poem, and what is an actual experience of body, and body mixed with desire.
Right. I understand the book was inspired by a trip to Italy?
Yeah.
Tell us about that. Paintings, right?
Yeah. It was my first time there, and my experience in the museums was just so different than anything I'd experienced quite in American museums where I'd spent time, in that just the vastness of some of these museums and the collection of medieval and Renaissance art that is it just overwhelmed me, how the same scenes come over and over and over and over and over, to the point where there were parts like, I can't look at one more crucifixion or I'm just going to lose it, right? It's too much, right? And thank God I am not living in a time where I get to choose between like 5 scenes and that's it. It just felt, in some ways, just so limiting. But then, there would also be that experience of going into a new room and thinking, okay, I'm really glad that there's another crucifixion, because that's unbelievable.
Really? You could still be moved by them.
I could still be moved. And so the Annunciation, out of all of these sort of repetitive scenes, is the one that certainly drew me.
It's one of the 5 or so scenes that shows up again and again.
Yeah. And so some of these paintings, the Fra Angelico and the Simone Martini, the Botticelli, right? These.
The one on the cover there?
These are. I was really seeing them for the first time.
Yes.
And they were just absolutely amazing to me. So I started thinking about, I'm so glad not to have these limitations anymore.
Yes.
But I wondered, was there something about having those limitations that actually was a productive prompt that helped these artists arrive at these paintings? And so I started thinking, what would it mean to bring that kind of limitation to a set of poems? And what could that, bumping up against that limitation in poetry, could that get me somewhere I didn't expect to go?
Right. It certainly does.
It did.
Yeah. Your interest in Mary, though, predated that trip for sure. Right. Your name, for instance.
Yes.
Not a coincidence, right?
Right. Well, growing up Catholic.
Yeah. You knew a lot of Marys.
I knew. Well, it wasn't even so much knowing a lot of Marys, though I knew some. It was just always being inundated with the Mother Mary.
Yes.
Right? And always feeling like I was, that she was just this beautiful, impossible.
It's the impossible I'd like to talk
ideal.
about. Yeah. It is a strange and increasingly complicated ideal to hold up to young women in a liberal society like ours.
Well, and a really problematic one.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and one I took terribly seriously, right? Partly, I think, because of the name identification.
But also because of your interest in
Absolutely, all of that.
But if you're in a society that believes in equality and sexual liberation, the image of Mary is a tough one.
Right. Right. And one that I think has really done terrible damage, right? In terms of, that, I mean, that's a kind of straitjacket ideal, right? It doesn't give you any room. Yeah. I mean, all you can do is fail.
Yes.
All you can do is fail. and the sense of measuring yourself against something impossible constantly. So the sense of being fallen, of not measuring up. And there's something profoundly inhuman about her.
About that idea.
Right? So I think part of the impulse of this book was wanting to tear down that ideal, right? The ideals of purity, the ideals of femininity. I mean, she is valued because she is a mother and because she is a virgin.
Right,
and
a paradox.
I am not either, right? So how do you make your way in the world as a woman when you are not aspiring to and cannot be valued for either of those, and do not want to be valued for either of those, right? Creating a new relationship to her, which is a way of creating a new relationship to myself, is part of, I think, the struggle of the book.
Giving her a voice that works for a modern person. In one of your poems, Mary looks back ruefully and says, "I was so young, so entirely agreeable to the task."
Right. Well, and I mean, and that I think very much coincides with this poem I just read, I mean, which ends with her acquiescing.
Yes.
And it's a dutiful fall, right? That Annunciation Eve to Ave, right? One of the things that is said about Mary is that her yes redeems Eve's no.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And so the question of what one says yes to and what one says no to, especially what women say yes to and what women say no to, is one of the issues that I think keeps coming to these poems.
Right. I want to talk about another Mary for a minute, Mary Daly, the feminist scholar at Boston College, who annoyed the administration there and the Pope for many, many years. I think she was there more than 30 years. In her foundational book, Gynecology, which you still have to read. It is, maybe you read it years ago. It's still absolutely shockingly wonderful. She writes about the Annunciation this way. You probably read this in graduate school. In the charming story of the Annunciation, the angel Gabriel appears to the terrified young girl, announcing that she has been chosen to become the mother of God. Her response to this sudden proposal from the Godfather is total non-resistance. "Let it be done unto me according to thy word." Physical rape is not necessary when the mind, will, and spirit has already been invaded. In refined religious rapism, the victim is impregnated with the supreme seminal idea who becomes the Word made flesh. Within this rapist Christian myth of the virgin birth, the role of Mary is utterly minimal. She is just there. She just gives consent. Pope loved that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, that kind of violence is very much part of what I think about through a lot of these scenes. But part of what I was also wanting to reclaim in the book was what I actually find very moving about this scene as well. So I'm not, I didn't pick this scene just because I wanted just because I hated it. I picked the scene because there's something incredibly moving to me about the image. And I have a long history with it. I grew up attending the Church of the Annunciation.
Yes.
So it literally is an image that I looked at a long time.
Stained glass windows.
And, but I think part of what the painters renewed for me, in part, was a sense of, all the other sort of scenes that are repeated have often, this central figure, right? Here's the manger scene or the crucifix scene, right? There's that center subject. This is a scene of encounter, right?
Yes.
And it's a scene of encounter between two very different kinds of being, right? A human and something not human, right? Something, in this case, from a divine realm. And what that other is a little mysterious.
Yes.
Right? And maybe more than a little. I mean, one of the things I love about the paintings, actually, one of the things that drew me is that Gabriel looks very feminine in most of these paintings. It looks like a scene between two women, right? Which is part of what I loved about it, the sort of androgyny of that figure. And the possibilities that come with that. But still at its heart, I see a scene where somebody is able to a human is actually able to see and perceive someone she didn't expect to see.
Right.
And can hear this being, perceive this being, and is transformed.
Yes.
Right? And that is actually incredibly moving to me. That maybe where transformation can come from is actually being open and present to some kind of otherness.
Right.
Right? And actually being able to perceive it. Even though, I love that the artists tend to really honor this space between them, right? So there aren't many images where, you get the sense that they're, embracing or even touching.
They're always about to touch.
They're always about to.
Right.
Which to me...
More electric.
It's an electric, the subject is the space between them,
yes.
But it is a space. It doesn't suggest that there's suddenly complete understanding or knowing or even communication, right? But something has been understood and communicated. I love that.
Did you read a poem called Conversion Figure on page 6? The problem with Mary Daly, as provocative as she was and as her writing still is that once she said that, there's nowhere else to go. Whereas what you say, you can keep exploring and keep thinking about, and it is enriching.
Well, and I think finding subjects of which one feels of two minds.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
Auden's poems are the clear expressions of mixed feelings.
Yes.
Spaces where things can be as complicated as they actually are.
Right. Right.
In some way. Conversion figure. I spent a long time falling toward your slender, tremulous face. A long time slipping through stars as they shattered, through sticky clouds with no confetti in them. I fell toward Earth's stony colors until they brightened, until I could see the green and white stripes of party umbrellas propped on your daisied lawn. From above, you looked small as an afterthought, something lightly brushed in. Beside you, blush pink plates served up their pillowy cupcakes, and your rosy hems swirled round your dark head. I fell and fell. I fell toward the pulse in your thighs, toward the cool flamingo of your slip, toward the cool flamingo of your slip, fluttering past your knees. Out of God's mouth I fell like a piece of ripe fruit toward your deepening shadow. Girl on the lawn without sleeves, knees bare even of lotion. Time now to strip away everything you try to think about yourself. Put down your little dog. Stop licking the cake from your fingers. Before today, what darkness did you let into your flesh? What stillness did you cast into the soil? Lift up your head. Time to enter yourself. Time to make your own sorrow. Time to unbrighten and discard even your slenderness.
That's a really eerie, unsettling poem. It's Gabriel's point of view at the Annunciation. You've moved it way up into the 21st century, and you've really emphasized the age of Mary, which is quite young, quite younger than we're used to thinking of her.
Right.
It's a very uncomfortable poem.
Well, Rilke says every angel is terrifying. Not all kinds of transformation are welcome kinds of transformation, right? Transformation can be terrible.
Yeah. In another one of your poems, you blend in lines from Lolita and the Star Report.
Yeah.
That's a hilarious idea. What possibly made you think of that?
I was thinking a lot about this scene
Yes.
and scenes in the world, the kinds of encounters that we see around us that echo it
Yes.
in some way, in all kinds of ways, right? And so going back to the more ideas of sexual charge and of violence.
Right, and predators.
Predators, right? These are two scenes in our popular imagination
Yes.
that are very different and yet have some overlap.
Right.
And so instead of just doing one on each of them, I thought, well, what if I just tried to do a framework where all three scenes sort of shimmer at once?
Yeah.
Right? So that it can provoke us to think about the similarities and differences.
That's transgressive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's take a little break. Just stand up, wave your arms around. I love your love poems, or maybe I should call them love-lorn poems. Most of them are sad. That might be too trite a word to use to describe your great love poems, but they are sad. In one of the poems you say, there is courtship and there is hunger. I suppose there are grips from which even angels cannot fly. But love is a real challenge in your poems, as I suppose it is in our lives. Would you read this poem, Self-Portrait with a Bee in My Mouth?
It might help for me to preface this a little bit, and that it actually was inspired because I did have a bee in my mouth once.
Terrible.
Got into a soda can.
Yeah.
Oh,
You've had that.
through the straw.
Wow. But the self-portrait with a bee in my mouth, the thing that is a buzz within the speaker is a kind of language of romance. So the thing that probably inspired it more than the bee was I was in a bookstore and I came across this book that was called A Romance Writer's Phrase Book.
How handy.
And this huge book just filled with phrases for romance writers to just pick up and put into their prose.
Nice.
And
Like panther-like loins, those sort of lines?
totally.
Okay.
And I was kind of amazed by this book. I'd never thought of such a thing. And one of the things that I was just taken with is reading, paging through it, is every phrase was just utterly familiar.
Yes.
Of course it was, right? Even though I had never actually read a romance book in my life, and of course that's how those things work, right? This is the cliches that are all around us, whether or not we're going after them ourselves.
Right.
And one of the things that occurred to me was, I've been operating, thinking of myself and my relationships as if I'm so above this, right? The language of romance, like that doesn't have anything to do with me.
You're so much deeper than that.
I'm much more sophisticated than that.
Exactly.
And I realized, oh my God, this is completely in me, because every phrase I look at just feels like I'm just reading something that I already know, right? So I absolutely carry it. And I thought it's probably been shaping a lot more of my perceptions and my experience than I've ever cared to think about. So that's what I imagine as a buzz within the speaker, is this language of romance. So self-portrait with a bee in my mouth. I said no, and then it was a buzz inside me, all wings, restless, raw lust for romance. You were undressing, peeling off the thick socks you'd sweat through. It wasn't you I'd refused. You smelled of cut grass. Your back ached. You closed your eyes for a moment before I kissed you in what I believed was silence. But the buzz started up, hovered, as I searched out your lips, as I pulled you toward me, as I succumbed to the force of your lips. Though I kissed, of course, you, not the forceful domination of his lips. Like a bee in a glass jar, my mind buzzes, but the bee is in my mouth. The buzzing sometimes is so quiet, I don't know it's there. I've tried to tempt it out. Weeding the garden, I nuzzle my cheek against the thick-veined petals, fragrances rising like incense. Only more fly in. I have only to touch you to be suddenly lifted into the cradle of your arms, to surrender completely. I lose you in the buzzing. All wings restless and a kind of anger in it. An open flower, a prairie rose, a little past bloom, and still unattended. See how close a body can come to having wings. They pick and play me as if I were made for them. What was I made for then?
Nice. Very nice. It's an erotic companion to I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. This is I Heard a Fly Buzz When I... in Twelfth Night from the Willow Cabin, you ask, what separates self from the flutter of longing? They don't fit the way these spoons fit into each other. They're more like knives that won't stack. That's just a perfect example of the way you pose a question that only a poem can answer. Now, what does separate self from the flutter of longing? There's no answer to that question, but your poem, expresses a kind of answer. In another poem you write, seduction was still a form of disappointment. I think I've been there. And in another you say, we are not women formed of words, but of impossible longings. I mean, there's frequently, in the sense, an almost but ultimately unfulfilled desire in these poems. Would you read The Troubadours, etc.? It's your opening poem, I think, in that book.
The Troubadours, etc. Just for this evening, let's not mock them. Not their curtsies or cross garters or ever-recurring pepper trees in their gardens, promising. At least they had ideas about love. All day we've driven past cornfields, past cows poking their heads through metal contraptions to eat. We've followed West 84, and what else? Irrigation sprinklers fly past us, huge wooden spools in the fields, lounging sheep, telephone wires, yellowing, flowering shrubs. Before us, above us, the clouds swell, layers of them, the violet underneath of clouds. Every idea I have is nostalgia. Look up. There is the sky that passenger pigeons darkened and filled, darkened for days, eclipsing sun, eclipsing all other sound by the thunder of their wings. After a while, it must have seemed that they followed not instinct or pattern, but only one another. When they stopped, Audubon observed, they broke the limbs of stout trees by the weight of their numbers. And when we stop, we'll follow what? Our hearts. The Puritans thought that we are granted the ability to love only through miracle. But the troubadours knew how to burn themselves through, how to make themselves shrines to their own longing. The spectacular was never behind them. Think of days of scarlet-breasted, blue-winged birds above you. Think of me in the garden, humming quietly to myself in my blue dress, a blue darker than the sky above us, a blue dark enough for storms, though cloudless. At what point is something gone completely? The last of the sunlight is disappearing even as it swells. Just for this evening, won't you put me before you until I'm far enough away you can believe in me? Then try to come closer, my wonderful and less than.
At least they had ideas about love. All my thoughts are about nostalgia? It's like you're a 90-year-old woman. What? And then there's this gorgeously sad poem about being trapped in a cold relationship. To You Again, on page 50.
That was about being trapped in a cold relationship?
This one.
Oh.
This one. To You Again, isn't it?
I don't think so.
Really?
Right.
This description of him upstairs working, you downstairs working, the two of you never really connecting. This is going on all over Washington. But have I totally misread that poem? Partially misread.
I guess
that
I
poem.
don't think of it as so sad.
Okay.
Myself. It is, because it ends with, yes, it's very, very hard, but there's still the ordinariness of the ways in which we do wake up together.
Yes.
And you are going to come downstairs and tell me something, and I'll say, okay, I'll go on being you're never enough. That we're never enough, really,
Right.
for one another. But we can go on being one another's never enough, right? And that...
You're not convincing me at all. Well, let's get them in on this too. They don't know the poem, so read the poem.
Okay. To you again. Again this morning, my eyes woke up too close to your eyes. They're almost green orbs, too heavy-lidded to really look back. To wake up next to you is ordinary. I do not even need to look at you to see you, but I do look. So when you come to me in your opulent sadness, I see you do not want me to unbutton you, so I cannot do the one thing I can do. Now it is almost 1 a.m. I am still at my desk and you are upstairs at your desk, a staircase away from me. Already it is years of you, a staircase away from me. To be near you and not near you is ordinary. You are ordinary. Still, how many afternoons have I spent peeling blue paint from our porch steps, peering above hedgerows, the few parked cars for the first glimpse of you? How many hours under the overgrown pink camellias, thinking the color was wrong for you, thinking you'd appear after my next blink. Soon you'll come down the stairs to tell me something, and I'll say, okay, okay. I'll say it like that, say it just like that. I'll go on being you're never enough. It's not the best in you I long for. It's when you're noteless, numb at the ends of my fingers. All is all I say it is.
It's really, really lovely. And it really captures the complexity of a kind of relationship.
Yeah. I mean, there's that old saying of one of the Desert Fathers. He says, do not give your heart to that which cannot satisfy your heart, right? But we do, and we have to, right? I mean, nobody's going, we're going to have to trust people who aren't always, they're going to disappoint us sometimes. Right? And I think that's okay. We still have to take that leap of faith and leap of trust and be in it together.
We can't leave
space in which being there together is enough.
Yes, yes. We can't leave the subject of love without talking about octopus love. The remarkable concluding poem of this volume is called The Lushness of It. And it's both a subject and a treatment you have never heard before. You're on.
The lushness of it. It's not that the octopus wouldn't love you, not that it wouldn't reach for you with each of its tapering arms. you'd be as good as anyone, I think, to an octopus. But the creatures of the sea, like the sea, don't think about themselves or you. Keep on floating there, cradled, unable to burn. Abandon yourself to the sway, the ruffled eddies. Abandon your heavy legs to the floating meadows of seaweed and feel the bloom of photoplankton, spindrift, sea spray, barnacles. In the dark benthic realm, the slippery nectin glide over the abyssal plain, and as you float, you can feel that upwelling of cold, deep water touch the skin stretched over your spine. No, it's not that the octopus wouldn't love you. If it touched, if it tasted you, each of its 3 hearts would turn red. Will theologians of any confession refute me? Not the blue-capped salmon, not its dotted head.
When you get to those 3 hearts, does it have 3 hearts? Yeah, that's... it was brilliant of God to think of that. Because until that moment, I thought, why is the octopus doing at the end of this book, this particular book? What were you thinking as you arranged these poems? There are a lot of birds, a lot of angels, of course. That makes perfect sense. But then the octopus comes out of nowhere.
Well, I think it's the idea of encountering some kind of creature that's very much not human.
Yes,
right?
It's so weird, and so odd.
Very weird, very frightening.
Yes.
In some way, and that potential of giving over to it is very frightening, and yet I think the idea of love is how I wanted to end the book.
Right, and it is sort of all those arms.
An embrace,
Right.
right? I think sometimes it's very difficult to parse out love from appetite, right? The octopus has appetite, right? But I think I wanted, this might sound really silly, but when I taught high school, I once gave the very silly assignment of asking 9th graders to define art.
Art.
Or at least define the qualities of it in some way that they liked. And I had one young woman who was just learning to speak English, and she wrote this sentence that stayed with me. And she said, "Art is anything that you know was very hard to make."
Nice.
And you feel loved by that.
Oh.
And something in that just resonated with me so much.
Sure.
The care somebody takes in making something for you to enter, right, and to be with. And there's I think a tension here. That's not what the octopus is doing, but I hope the poem is doing
Right.
that on some level with its rhymes and its form. So I wanted them both awash
Right.
there.
Right. And then being enveloped not only by the octopus, but by the ocean itself relates to the theme of incarnation,
Yeah.
too, of course. Motherhood runs through these poems, too, of course, as a part of the image of the Virgin Mary. I understand you lost your own mother last year, and clearly there's someone dying while you were writing these poems, or the poems were about that. Did anything help? Faith? Friends? Time? As you dealt with the grief? Poetry? Did writing about it help?
Nothing helps in the way you want help, right?
Yeah.
Nothing helps in the way that what I want, the help I want is the restoration,
Right.
right? And it doesn't help that way. But it does help in other ways, I think, in trying to I don't know. I'm not sure I can articulate.
I don't blame you.
very easily, but there's wanting to carry something forward
Right.
from her,
Right.
And not, I think one way we think of carrying our parents forward is having children ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
right, and carrying forth. But I do think there are other ways. In Genesis, we're told, be fruitful and multiply.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other ways to be fruitful and multiply than with human beings.
Right. Whitman
With-
talks about
with-
all his poems.
With language. I
Right.
mean, in Genesis also, it's a God who says, no, you will not create a Babel where everything can be understood and communicated. It forces a world where full translation and understanding is sort of impossible, and yet gives us the task of being fruitful and multiplying meanings and languages. And I think that can be the work of grieving too, of trying to, I do think poems can be a space to speak to the dead. It's one of the things I love about them, and trying to carry things forward from those we've lost.
I can't remember the poem. In one of your poems, there's a little girl running around who's so full of life, and you want to take that girl and put her on your mother's lap, and you say, there must be a little life left in you.
And that actually isn't for my mother. That's for another friend who died. But yeah, yeah.
Did you read a poem called Holy?
Sure.
Page 39.
Holy. Spirit who knows me, I do not feel you fall so far in me, do not feel you turn in my dark center. My mother is sick and you cannot help her. My beautiful moon-faced mother is sick and you sleep in the dark edges of her shadow. Spirit made to know me, is this your weight in my throat, my chest, the breath heavy so I hardly breathe it? I do not believe in the beauty of falling. Over and over in the dark, I tell myself, I do not have to believe in the beauty of falling. Though she edges toward you, saying your name with such steadiness. I sit winding blue tape around my wrists to keep my hands from falling. Holy Ghost, I come for you today in this overlit afternoon as she picks at the bread with her small hands, her small, rough hands, the wide blue veins that have always been her veins, winding through them. Ghost, what am I if I lose the one who's always known me? Spirit, know me. Shadow, are you here, splintering into the bread's thick crust as it crumbles into my palms? Is that you, the dry cough in her lungs, the blue tape on my wrists, the dark hair that used to fall over her shoulders? Fragile mother, impossible spirit, will you fall so far from me? Will you leave me to me? To think it is the last hard kiss, that seasick silence, your bits of breath diffusing in my mouth.
That is a very complicated prayer. It's doing,
I think it is.
doing a lot of different things at once. A pleading for faith and a statement of doubt, an acknowledgement of death and an affirmation of immortality, all at the same time, which of course is what we do when we are confronted with these tragedies, which we are. Yeah, it's a remarkable, remarkable piece. There's a longing in these poems for mother, and then there's a longing for motherhood, too. In one poem you write, Mary tells herself that if only she could have a child she could carry around like an extra lung, the emptiness inside her would stop gnawing. And later...
But then I say, but it's hard to tell if she believes this.
Yes. It's a very witty poem. I think that's a poem told in prose, isn't it? Yeah. And later you say, I'm afraid I've become one of those childless women who reads too much about the deaths of children. It's a very painful, negative image of the Annunciation, a sort of absence of Annunciation in the speaker's life. Would you read a poem called So-and-so Descending from the Bridge, and maybe tell us the news event that seems to have inspired this poem?
Sure. So a few years ago in Portland, Oregon, where I live, a woman threw her 2 children off a bridge in the middle of the night. One survived. And it happened really just a few stones throw from where I was sleeping. So-and-so descending from the bridge. It is so-and-so, and not the dusty world, who drops. It is their mother, and not the dusty world, who drops them. Why I imagine her so often empty-handed as the houseboat's distant lights rise and fall on the far ripples, I do not know. I know that darkness, have stood on that bridge in the space between the streetlights, dizzy with looking down. Maybe some darks are deep enough to swallow what we want them to, but you can't have 2 worlds in your hands and choose emptiness. I think that she will never sleep as I sleep, I who have no so-and-so to throw or mourn or to let go. But in that once, with no more mine, this little so and that one, she is what outnights me, so close, so-called crazy little mother who does not jump.
It's a powerful and startling reconsideration of that tragedy from a point of view we don't often think of. The point of view of someone with no children to throw off a bridge, who would do anything to have a child. We can't leave these people with that.
No, let's not. I mean, one of the things that struck my imagination about the scene, because it haunted me so much, I realized the scene itself was a kind of foil for the Annunciation, right? At least in the images we get of it, right? There's something that descends to Mary, and then she is with child. And here's a scene of a woman with children, and then is without them. Right.
A horrifying variation on the theme. Here, there are blueberries.
Okay.
That is a lovely poem to end with.
It was inspired by thinking about the repetition, the use of repetition in the Psalms, in the music that makes. But trying to occupy a very different kind of voice within it. Here, there are blueberries. When I see the bright clouds, a sky empty of moon and stars, I wonder what I am, that anyone should note me. Here, there are blueberries. What should I fear? Here there is bread in thick slices, of whom should I be afraid? Under the swelling clouds we spread our blankets. Here in this meadow we open our baskets to unpack blueberries, whole bowls of them, berries not by the work of our hands, berries not by the work of our fingers. What taste the bright world has, whole fields without wires, the blackened moss, the clouds swelling at the edges of the meadow. And for this I did nothing, not even wonder. You must live for something, they say. People don't live just to keep on living. But here's the quince tree, a sky bright and empty. Here there are blueberries. There is no need to note me.
That is a benediction. Thank you so much. Such a lovely evening.